I'm fairly certain we've all been there before. You just got done beating Resident Evil 2 for like the 10 billionth time, and you're still feeling the itch for some PS1 era goodness. So you open up Steam and search for the term survival horror, only to be met with a seemingly never-ending list of Unity Store asset flips and first-person non-combat Amnesia clones. Well, you might as well call me Moses, because I've just parted the sea of trash-tier horror titles and low-quality hentai games, opening up the path to the best survival horror projects the indie scene has to offer. And, you know, the higher-quality hentai titles. Once again, I put together a list of some incredibly unique, interesting, and obscure survival horror games that here on this channel we've come to lovingly know as Resident Evil clones. And this time we've got an absolute feast for the high-class 32-bit pixel snob, so let's get down to business. What's up, guys? I'm Jared, and this is Avalanche Reviews. Usually when I put these videos together, I already have a full list of games to include, but sometimes I've only got a few in mind and I need to go out looking for more, which was the case with Okureta Shukudai, or Late Homework. And listen, that's not a flex, you just gotta understand I so rarely come across game titles that include kanji I can actually read. Just please, give me this. Anyways, I'm really happy that I needed some extra titles to include in this entry of modern RE clones because this one ended up being an amazingly memorable experience. Released in October of last year, Late Homework completely flew under my radar. It was developed by Soda Raptor, which some of you guys might remember from the last entry in this video series where we talked about another one of his projects, Pathogen X. A very cool third-person shooter with obvious survival horror-inspired visual themes. When covering that game, I got a real good look at how well Soda Raptor understood PS1 visual aesthetics and fun shooting mechanics, but their ability to churn out a product that felt refined and finished was still up in the air as far as I was concerned. Well, you can go ahead and consider that a settled matter, because despite its short runtime, Late Homework has an atmosphere, gameplay, puzzles, and an overall vibe that puts most modern horror titles to shame. The story starts out with our main character Hanako describing how hard of a time she's been having in school lately. She complains about feeling out of it all the time and being a little foggy-headed, which has had a big effect on her grades, and explains why she's on this bus right now. Apparently, she forgot a bunch of her past due homework assignments at school, and this is a last chance sort of scenario to get her grades up high enough to pass. Outside of that though, her main issue is that this school is the last place she'd prefer to be heading at this time of day thanks to a bunch of her fellow students ending up on the news as missing person cases surge in the area. And of course it doesn't help that there's been a rumor spreading around concerning some sort of an entity that roams the halls at night looking for souls to feast on. And believe me, I'd love to dive into the story here because there's a lot more going on than meets the eye, but because the game's not all that long and one of the many factors that makes it so great is its story, I think I'll just leave the summary right there. We're a cat stuck in a creepy school at night and there's a terrifying creature stalking the halls that wants nothing more than you. Except without your head. In terms of gameplay, Late Homework wastes absolutely no time in getting to work. Right as you gain control of Hanako, in the very first screen of the game, you'll come across an obvious sign that you're going to be key hunting and puzzle solving your way through this mystery, which turns out to be a very accurate initial impression because this game is a dead serious dosage of survival horror goodness, except for the times when it isn't. Look, there's a lot here that does fall a bit outside the genre in my opinion, but it's surrounded by and weighed against so many other staple mechanics and systems that I've got no problem giving it a pass. And you know, here in the script I actually wrote a note to myself reminding me to make up some sort of a school hall pass pun for that, but I can't, so moving on. For example, we've got obvious survival horror staples like amazing fixed camera angles, tank controls, brain-wrinkling puzzle solving, and backtracking with a side of key hunting. But tempering that, we've got no inventory management, a lack of limited or really any resources, and what I would call the biggest offender, no combat. Like I've talked about before, I sort of feel like a survival horror game needs to have combat in it as an option. Even if the goal is to not engage with it or for the developer to disincentivize it, the decision to or not to initiate an encounter makes up a lot of the ethos surrounding the genre. I'd say in this case though, there's so much old PS1 survival horror DNA included that even I can't nitpick the particulars. Speaking of which, we have almost lethal levels of SH love radiating off of this thing. I mean, look at this map screen. This feels more authentic to Silent Hill than a lot of the later entries in that very series. Back to the actual gameplay though, the general layout is one centrally located around the idea of tough but fun puzzle solving. At the start of the game, you don't have a direct way to get inside Fushigina High, but the few areas you do have access to will lead you straight into a few rooms filled with keys and adventure game style puzzles, which is the kind that poses some sort of an environmental roadblock that's going to require the right item to be used in the right place. Once you actually get inside the school, it's roughly the same format but covering a much wider landscape, and there's a persistent stalker type of monster thrown in there for good measure. This horrific, pants-shittingly scary creature roams the halls of Fushigina, and it's a one-hit kill if it manages to catch you. On the plus side, you can run pretty fast, and there's a dedicated button for looking behind you, so it shouldn't be too hard to stay relatively safe after maybe 1 or 2 deaths. You're actually given 3 lives to get through the game, which is a little strange for a title like this, but given the short nature of late homework and all the other unique design decisions made in it, I don't know, it kind of fits in a bit. And I have to say, all of the puzzles and the locked doors that you're going to come across inside the school are simply survival horror perfection. There's this really impressive balance being struck here between needing to think but not getting railroaded for the next 20 minutes while you scratch your head wondering what the developer is trying to make you notice in the room. It's a solid combination of needing the right item and reading a note or paying attention to the environment to find a password, and at least for me, it was just the right level of challenge. I think the game's set up in a way that by the time you come across a key or an item, you probably already passed by the exact location you'll need it in, making it really easy to drop into a flow state while playing. Every inch of Fushigina High is this really intriguing puzzle box that you procedurally unlock while trying to uncover the mystery of the missing students and why there's a hellspawn demon walking the halls looking to decapitate cute anthropomorphic cats. And while the gameplay for the most part is just peak genre fare, I've got to say it's really the atmosphere and the mood of late homework that stayed in my mind long after I finished it. The dark environments, colored lighting, music, and sound effects, they all feel like puzzle pieces in the sense that they slot into each other perfectly to form a complete picture of the kind of place you don't necessarily want to be in, but oxymoronically find sort of soothing in its scary unapproachableness. As you all know, I am an eternal supporter of the PS1 visual aesthetic, no matter how hard it gets played out in the indie scene, but outside of the amazing dithering and low-poly design, I think the sound work deserves special mention. Not just the music, even though it is great, but the sound effects and environmental ambiance too. Like Silent Hill 3, there's a big focus on unexplained noises, like when you walk into a maintenance room only for someone to start banging on the door outside. But I was more wowed with the less obvious stuff. For example, the distinct change from being outside in the almost overpowering rain and then heading inside where getting near a window will give you a more muffled, soothing version of that same sound. Honestly, the entire package here is just a 10 out of 10. Soda Raptor obviously knows what makes a good horror game and how to accurately strike a balance between a retro and technically impressive look. I am, however, obligated to at least give the passing impression of objectivity, which means we gotta talk about some downsides, even if they border on not mattering. And I'd say the first issue I ran into was that I couldn't get VSync working with the game. No matter what I set it to in the options, I kept getting screen tearing, which bothered the hell out of me. Now, I think normally this wouldn't have been quite so bad, but with the dithering, you always have a lot of small details on screen that can make the rolling tears a lot more visible than they may have been when set against a pitch black sky or something like that. On the plus side, I was able to go through my GPU's control panel and force triple buffering, VSync, and 60 FPS, which solved the issue. After having the exact same problem with a bunch of the other games on this list though, I'm starting to think either I need to update my graphics drivers or maybe it has something to do with me playing these on a 144Hz monitor. Less annoying, but still kind of frustrating, was the fact that the mouse's cursor shows up every time you interact with something, even if you're using a controller. Of course, this is a very small issue, but I feel like this one little arrow sort of messes with the otherwise perfect image that the game's cultivating. And you know, this is gonna sound strange for me, but I think that's the only negatives I came away with. Late Homework was an absolutely incredible playthrough for me, and I could not be more happy that I felt like I needed a few more titles to put in this video to make it complete. I mean, this is probably one of the easiest recommendations I've ever made on here before. It's pure crystallized survival horror in all the ways that count. It's cute as hell, has a surprisingly disturbing story, and only costs $5 or $6. I mean, you could sit and think for days, and you probably couldn't dream up a more perfect scenario than that. Before we hop into the next game on the list, I'm really excited to let you guys know that today's video is sponsored by literally no one. To be totally honest with you guys, I'm not really big on the idea of brands paying me money to express opinions I may not legitimately hold. That being the case, if you enjoy what I do here on the channel, I would immensely appreciate a little bit of help doing it. I've got a Patreon, which is linked both in the description and the pinned comment, or you could click that join button beneath the video to become a YouTube member. The incredible people who support me on either platform are the reason I'm able to continue making videos on the games and subjects that I want to, and not what's the most popular thing in the YouTube algorithm at the moment. So if you find yourself with a bit of pocket change left over at the end of the month, I could not be more appreciative if you decided to throw some of it my way. For those of you that can't, or more understandably don't want to, no worries. I am wildly lucky just to have you as a viewer. So in summary, the wonderful people whose names have been scrolling down your screen help me continue making content here on this channel, and if it wasn't obvious so far, I love being able to do that more than anything. So thank you very much to anyone who has ever or will ever take part in that effort, and to you for your time. Now let's get back to the video. When I started covering these new indie survival horror games, I made a bit of a soft rule for myself. While the series is titled RE Clones, there's a bit of hidden text in there that reads only classic RE. Of course, you could see that as further proof of my very public bias, but it was more of a self-preservation thing. Think about it. If we brought in the scope to include titles that played like Resident Evil 4, this series would span most video games developed from like 2008 till the moment I finished speaking this sentence. That being said, I have heard a lot of buzz about the Killing Antidote, and I got to see it in action in a G-Man Lives video, so I figured what the hell, let's give it a shot.
And I gotta say as well that I think it's a weird creative choice that they made these shower cinematics go for like 4 hours.
What I guess you could call my journey with the Killing Antidote started off with its free demo. And after playing that for a bit, I walked away feeling a little underwhelmed. I mean, there was some really cool shooting, and I could see these ideas at some point getting solidified into something a lot more concrete, but more than anything, I was just looking for a little more story.
2033年4月8日夜里1点10分，这里是隶属于 X 基因科技的第7生化研究所。
As you explore the demo area, you're given a small window into the narrative by checking computers for emails, which delivers a slightly fear-esque story where you pick up on larger events as coworkers gossip and trade rumors with each other. Overall, not a terrible way to handle things, but I was looking for a bit more, so I bought into the early access version of the game for $30, thinking maybe there'd be a little more setup or something like that, which turned out to be, not the case. But the money was already spent, so I was determined to see if the, well, not full version, but I guess paid version of the game had any more to offer than the demo, which it kinda does and it doesn't. And with that lead up covered, let's go ahead and dive into the game. Now, like some of you know, normally I would talk about story here, but there's not really more than 2 sentences worth of it to talk about. There's been some sort of an outbreak, and it's been traced to a manufacturing and research building owned by a pharmaceutical company. That's it, that's all of it. Moving on to the gameplay, we have a sort of RE2 remake approach to controls, except actually a little more responsive. Honestly, it's a nice feeling balance between being able to move how you want to, but also needing to account for a bit of animation weight. Both the demo and the paid version just sort of dump you into the area of your choosing, and it doesn't take very long for you to experience the 2 main things you'll be doing here: looking for keys and items and engaging in combat. And I'll talk about the latter first because it's where I think the Killing Antidote actually performs its best. I'd say most of the time you'll be coming across your run-of-the-mill zombies, and like most games with The Walking Dead in them, these guys were the most fun for me to fight by far. You can get your hands on melee weapons like knives and an axe, which can be really effective. You've got yourself the obligatory fast and strong attacks, and using the slower, more powerful ones on an enemy that's already been staggered leads to these really cool finishing moves. Even when you encounter large groups, this mechanic makes the starting zombie a really fun enemy to come up against because you can easily deal with them, but their grabs and stumbling nature make sure they never become a non-threat. I'd say in terms of shooting, things aren't quite as satisfying as the aforementioned RE2 remake, mostly due to a lack of variety in enemy knockback and animation, but hot damn, you can have some fun regardless. I think one of the main aspects that makes things so engaging is that you're often encountering several bad guys in a single fight, and early on you're introduced to a variant that can jump at you, so there's a good amount of target optimization going on, and it's really easy for a situation that was at one point under your control to quickly change into a very fun but very chaotic clusterfuck. For just such an occasion, you're given a dodge move with a forgiving amount of iframes attached to it, and to be honest, this would have come in way more handy if I could have shaken decades of PC gaming muscle memory that just will not let me quickly react to a combat scenario by pressing left control. No joke, like 9 times out of 10, I would just end up hitting spacebar in a panic, so I think the next time I play the game, I'm just gonna swap those 2 keybinds. You know, to be totally honest, there are moments where the game's developer sets up some damn near amazing combat situations. Like, I'd be rounding a corner only to get jumped by a crowd of infected, and as I'm shooting and backing up, I run into a second group behind me. It made for some seriously just flat-out enjoyable gameplay, and I would imagine the combat is probably where these guys put a majority of their time. So if we make a pie graph out of the Killing Antidote's development, it would be like 99% modeling boobies and fashion items, and then 1% combat. So good news, right? Well, not entirely. The problem is you can't always be engaged in combat. There's got to be something else going on, and I think that's where the Killing Antidote really falls short for me. When I bought the early access version, I tried out the same area available in the demo, and to be honest with you, after I cleared out all the bad guys and was left strictly with the exploration and key hunting, I was bored out of my skull. In the starting area, things are a lot more compact and contained, so you'll mostly just be moving around a single floor or a couple of rooms looking for card keys or clues that'll open up these numerical keypad locks. And at this point, I'll say things were definitely moving in a promising direction. However, once I unlocked more of the building, I found myself constantly getting lost because there really wasn't much about any specific floor that made it stick out in my memory. And the developers, for some reason, thought no one would need a map to keep track of a pretty large set of floors and rooms. At one point, I needed to find a valve handle so I could stop some gas from flowing into a broken pipe, and I swear to you, I spent no less than 25-30 minutes retracing every step I had taken. I absolutely could not find anything that even fit that description, and I kept finding myself doubling back on the same exact areas because the environment was so samey looking. Eventually, I resorted to looking up a guide, and it turns out the wheel was in this room right here that I swear to God I completely searched no less than 3 times. Now yes, they did draw a big yellow circle around it, but it's also recessed behind a bunch of stuff that obscures that circle, and the indicator that lets you know something can be interacted with only activates when you're right up on an item. After that, the game engineered an excuse, obviously for my busty main character to take a shower, but I had to do a little fetch quest to get the water running, and by this point, I was just in an unconscious trance. Even the combat, which I'd had so much fun with before, just couldn't take me out of the boredom. When I finally got done with that, my character gets attacked by whatever this is, and I was thrown into a different part of the building without any of my weapons or healing items, which led to my first and last death. I mean, I did have a pretty close autosave to that point, but I just didn't have the energy to restart and see what else the game had in store for me. Which is a damn shame because I really did get a genuine kick out of shooting and fighting rotting corpses with other science experiments. Now, it does need to be said that Killing Antidote is in early access, so it's totally possible that it eventually gets to a much better place in terms of pacing, environmental design, and item hunting, but as it is now, I don't know that I can justify recommending anybody spending $30 on it. Personally, I'm fine with the cost because I got my money's worth out of the combat, but for most of you, you could get like 3/4 of that same experience by just playing the demo a few times through. And I guess here at the end, we probably should address the large, very well-endowed elephant in the room. There's no doubt about it, the Killing Antidote is like 80% gooner bait by volume, which to be fair is fine. I mean, I'm not exactly a prude. In my last video, I was complaining about a lack of booty jiggle effects in games, which, to be fair, this title actually addresses. That being said, it is a little hard for me to take a game seriously when I'm able to make a scenario where my protagonist is wearing nothing but her underwear and a backpack. And I say that because I think there is potential for a really well-rounded and serious story in this game. I guess what I'm trying to get at is, I want to give the Killing Antidote more respect than it's giving itself. Of course, it does need to be said that no one's forcing me into changing her clothes or dressing her up like a zombie apocalypse stripper, and that is true, but it's kind of hard to ignore it as a mechanic. I mean, you are going to be coming across tons of new outfits as rewards for exploration and puzzle solving. Really, when you think about it, it's not my fault at all. I'm actually being forced into this. And, the same thing goes for the sliders that make her boobs bigger. At the end of the day, it's not exactly something that ruins the game for me, but I think there are moments that could probably have been a little more emotionally impactful if I didn't know that someone was rock hard when viewing that same scene. Oh, and on an unrelated note, I think it's possible that the voice actor who showed up for this scene might have thought that she was there for a different sort of project. In my view, the Killing Antidote is a proof of concept, a combat system and a graphics engine that could probably be made to fit over a really cool modern zombie shooter, and even I can admit there are rudimentary elements of survival horror to be found in the early access build. As it is though, it's basically a $30 demo, and I couldn't really sleep at night if I told you guys it was worth the cost when you could probably buy 3 other games on this list for that same price and get a much more complete package. So I guess proceed with caution, and regardless of what you decide, just do me a favor and try the demo first. Alright, so I've joked on here before about some of the games in this video series feeling often like they were made just for me. Like the developer knew my specific niche taste and decided to combine them all together. Well, never, and I truly mean never, has that been more true than when I found out that indie dev Warkiss was working on a PS1 era mystery dungeon survival horror title. I mean, I'm genuinely speechless. That is such a cool goddamn idea. I would have never even considered it as a possibility because why would I? Like, do you leave your house every day for work, prepared for the off chance that someone might walk up to you on the street, ask you what you desire most in the world, and then just give it to you? So yes, I am incredibly excited to finally be playing this demo. However, before we start talking about House of Necrosis, I imagine a bit of an informative briefing might be in order. Okay, so the mystery dungeon genre is a much smaller offshoot of your normal turn-based JRPG, and there's a few identifying traits that sets it apart. One of the big ones being a bit of randomness in their operation. 90% of the time, this is going to mean entering procedurally generated, multi-floor dungeons. There's often a sort of hub area that stays constant, where the player can trade items, store equipment, or buy supplies, but once you step foot in one of those dungeons, there is literally no telling what might happen. You might come across an amazing weapon, or maybe the game will just spawn in an enemy 10 or 20 levels higher than you. Which can be a very daunting concept to swallow because these games also often have some sort of a serious penalty for death. A lot of the time, exiting a dungeon is going to revert your character back to level 1, which means the only way to make real tangible progress towards becoming stronger is to get your hands on some good gear. And like you would imagine, getting to a point where you're a god among men, only to get one-shotted and lose all that stuff is enough to make a grown man weep. I've heard. Anyways, getting back on point, the other main mechanic you'll always find in a mystery dungeon title is this very strange hybridized turn-based system, which can be easy to understand but kind of hard to verbally explain. The gist is that every single action in the game is going to consume a turn, including moving, attacking, or using items, and on top of that, every single thing on the current floor is going to make some sort of move after you do. So every single step you take or attack you make is going to trigger everything else in the dungeon with you to follow suit. And while I most definitely could go on much longer regarding this subject, we do have ourselves a demo to talk about. Okay, so House of Necrosis, despite what I said earlier, isn't actually a survival horror game. Like its Steam page says, it uses the genre mostly for inspiration. That being said, we have made exceptions in this video series before, and I think enough visual and mechanical motifs have made it through the mystery dungeon filter that it's more than earned its spot. The demo starts out with a text crawl that's gonna feel a tad familiar. A series of strange murders have been reported around a mansion in the woods, which results in a special forces team being sent in to investigate. When that squad fails to return from their mission, another group gets sent in to rescue the rescue team, and you were a part of that effort. After stepping inside, you've somehow been separated from your group, and now your goal is to meet back up with whatever's left of them, and that's about all you're going to get for the time being. After this brief setup, you're thrown into a dungeon where you'll have a chance to get familiar with the gameplay mechanics, and once you have those down to some degree, then the game's going to give you a real taste of what the genre's made of by spawning in a boss monster that you could never have a chance of beating. After getting dropped like a bad habit, you wake up in a strange room with an even stranger guy who says he dragged you out of the dungeon and into relative safety. He also says he doesn't really know where your teammates are, but if they're still in the mansion, they're probably dead. Well, we certainly didn't join up with the nondescript small-town militarized police force because we lacked tenacity, so we obviously head through the main hall and back into the dungeon, which is where we shift from the story and into the real draw here, at least as far as I'm concerned, the gameplay. In terms of mystery dungeon mechanics, you can expect all of the heavy hitters to make some sort of an appearance. Proc gen, reverting to level 1 when exiting a dungeon, the loss of all your items on death, and an absolute smorgasbord of cool equipment to experiment with. But I would say the one element that really makes House of Necrosis stand out in the genre is a focus on shooting stuff with guns, and I'm an American, so obviously that speaks to me spiritually. As you explore, you might come across small stashes of ammo, which will let you drop enemies from long range, but true to its inspirational roots, this is nowhere near a limitless resource. So for the most part, you're going to want to save any bullets you come across for bosses or similarly dire situations. Outside of that though, I'd say combat in this game is pretty standard fare for this type of an RPG. Since everything on the map is going to take turns after you do, it's in your best interest to use that mechanic strategically instead of just standing toe-to-toe with these monsters trading hits. One of the best ways to take the initiative is to burn through a couple of your turns by whiffing attacks so your target ends up wasting their turn closing the gap, which will give you a free hit. It's a fairly basic strategy for these type of games, but once you start digging into the nearly bottomless ocean that is HON's equipment though, things get much deeper. Like at one point, I got my hands on a knife with an electric modifier that damaged the enemies around the one that I was directly attacking, and a gun that would use my HP as ammo when I ran dry on bullets. After that, I ended up with a jacket that doubled my damage, both what I could dish out and what I could receive, and a katana that attacked the 3 tiles in front of my character. I mean, I could go on, but listen, I've never been shy about letting you guys know how I feel, and I hope that's led to something at least resembling some kind of a trust between us. So I need you all to understand that I am being as sincere as possible when I say that I don't love House of Necrosis. I'm in love with it. I mean, obviously, the sheer uniqueness of its combined genres and inspiration almost guaranteed that I would play it, but even I didn't expect it to floor me quite as hard as it has. Look, I'll drop the nonsense right here. I'm this close to just declaring it perfect. I mean, the mystery dungeon gameplay, the survival horror themes, the sound, the spells, the music, the presentation, it's all perfect. And you know, on that last point, it's very rare that a developer does this masterful of a job emulating PS1 era 240p graphics. I know it sounds like something that would be easy to replicate, but you really need to understand the games from that era to put together something as accurate as this. All the little stuff you might expect from a game on Sony's first console can be reliably found here. Affine texture warping, low draw distance leading to dark fog in the far reaches of the dungeons, and what you could call, let's say, rudimentary 3D character models. I mean, I guess I could keep talking, or I could just direct your attention to my previous declaration of absolute perfection. Now, I 100% get that this game is chasing a nearly microscopically specific niche, so there's a very good chance that it isn't going to be everyone's cup of tea. But even if you've never played a game like this before, I have to imagine you stumbling across my videos means you've got enough of an appreciation for early survival horror to justify taking a chance with a free demo on Steam. And who knows, maybe this is exactly the kind of push you need to discover your new favorite genre. I mean, I personally know that's possible because it's exactly what happened to me. I used to hate mystery dungeon games, but then I tried Squaresoft's Chocobo Dungeon on the PS1 just because I was so familiar with the Final Fantasy branding, and well, here we are. At the moment, the demo for House of Necrosis only allows you to make it through 5 floors of the dungeon and 1 boss before you get kicked back to the title screen. But in an act of absolute sainthood, they also give you the option to head right back into the game, further grinding for money and new items. Which is precisely why I currently have several hours logged in a demo that can easily be beaten in like 30 minutes. Listen, I'm gonna beg you, please, if you have even the slightest interest in anything I've said or have shown on screen so far, do yourself a favor and check out this absolute gem. Now, if any of you guys need anything, you'll be able to find me over at its developer's Twitter feed, refreshing the page until either they release the full demo or I expire from a lack of eating and sleeping. Sanguine by Ryan Berg is a classic survival horror game that has a planned release date of late 2025. What we're looking at here is the demo for the game, but going by its Steam page, I think it's more of an alpha, which is to say it's certainly more than a proof of concept, but a little less than a traditional demo. Based on my experience, the game's developer has a lot of the groundwork finished for the really important foundational stuff like movement, an inventory system, combat, and game locations. But a lot of the smaller features that you would associate with a more polished title are either not finished yet or a little half-baked. But without giving away the hook of this section of the video, what is here shows a lot of promise and indicates to me that this guy can probably be relied on to deliver a really solid finished product. The demo starts out with a warning of the game's less than finished status and the possible existence of bugs or crashes, but I'm really happy to say that I ran into zero issues like that outside of small things like zombie grab animations getting interrupted for the attacker but not for my main character, which led to her seeming to be choked by an invisible man. After that, we get some audio of what sounds like a car crash along with some unforeseen force telling us to wake up. Then we're taken to a screen where we could theoretically select either the classic fixed perspective of the genre or the more modern over-the-shoulder one. And even if the RE4 option was selectable in this demo, I think we all know which one I'd be going with regardless. So then we get to hop into the actual game, which sees our character Chris, with a K, coming out of the wreckage we heard from the start. After reading through a few tutorial messages informing us of stuff like tank controls and the map, we come across one of those diners that always seem to dot small highways and mountain towns. Only instead of down-home cooking and tired truckers, Chris comes across dead bodies and a few signs that shit has most definitely gone down here. Once we get a hold of the keys to the diner's front door, one of the corpses in the parking lot has his gooch just violated by this slug, which seems to reanimate his dead body and gives him these cool-looking glowing eyes. Robbing all of us of the masculine need to engage in combat with a supernatural monster, a police officer says he'll draw this thing away so Chris can get to safety, which she takes advantage of. And in terms of story, there's not much more than that. Essentially, there's some kind of a research group or pharmaceutical company in the town, and they've done precisely what those kind of organizations are best known for in popular media. Outside of that, there seems to be a local conspiracy type who saw this all coming.
You hear the helicopters? I hear them every day. I don't know what you're listening to. Wake up.
We can get in touch with that guy via a walkie-talkie, but from start to finish, all we get is the basic pieces of a vague setup, which I definitely won't complain about because I'm really liking what's on offer so far. It's got a nice early 90s horror flick kind of thing going on, and I'm vibing with it. However, getting to the important stuff, Sanguine has got a very classic survival horror set of tools to work with. Nice amounts of backtracking across a ruined, monster-infested environment, tank controls, classic combat, item hunting, and puzzle solving. In regards to that first point, I'm really liking this town as a setting. These sections near the highway feel pretty true to life, and the crashed cars and resulting destruction makes for a convincing, reanimated corpse outbreak scenario. In more mechanical terms, there's a nice variety of places to explore for a small demo, and you're given pretty interesting routes and roadblocks to deal with. This taste of the planned finished product gives us a knife, pistol, and shotgun to keep the hordes of slug-piloted corpses at bay, and with the exception of an awkward wind-up animation for the knife, this is exactly what I'd want out of combat in an indie survival horror game. There's definitely a level of polish missing, but we're looking at a very solid starting point for sure. The puzzle solving and progression, on the other hand, is where I ran into the most issues. Like you might expect from one of these games, Sanguine leads you down a relatively well-manufactured path dotted with locked doors, strange adventure game logic puzzles, and keys to find. Except it also relies on a lot of event flags that I don't think follow an understandable thread of logic. For example, at one point, the only way to progress is to go up to a door, see that it can't be opened, run around the entire environment looking for something else, and then come back to see that that door's been opened for you. Now, this is definitely something you can find in other titles in the genre, but usually it doesn't halt progression, or if it does, you're given clues that'll lead you back to where the flag is. I found that there were plenty of moments like this where you sort of have to guess what the developer might have been thinking when working on the game, as opposed to using the game world itself as your main source for clues. On that same level, I ran into a really annoying issue that kept me playing the demo much longer than it should normally take to get to the end. See, I had come across this painting, which is great because I can remember an empty spot on the diner's wall that looked like a painting was missing. So I go back to that spot and hit the action button and nothing. Then I try using the painting for my inventory, and I can't. Now I know what the Resident Evil pilled members of the audience are thinking, and yes, I did examine it in the inventory looking for clues, but once again, nothing. Only when I had exhausted all possible options and explored every area in the demo did I try examining it for the 30th time and find out that only the analog stick can move objects when you're examining them. Now this may sound like a small thing, but it's something I've noticed in a lot of survival horror games worked on by independent developers. If you're going to let me use the D-pad for movement and inventory navigation, I don't think it's unreasonable for me to assume that I can do other direction-based actions with that same D-pad. Like I said before though, this is sort of in an alpha state, so you do have to expect or maybe excuse things like this. If anything more than a critique, I think a video like mine might act as a nice playtest for the developer. That being said, like I also already mentioned, I think the guts of an awesome survival horror game is here on full display. You might have to dig through a little bit of jank and some less than finished ideas to get to it, but it's there. On that same note, I think Ryan has a very cool look cultivated for Sanguine. At first, I wasn't necessarily on board with the more, cartoony look to the 3D graphics, but I did eventually come around. And I think the colored lighting and recognizable but almost alien environments are a big reason for that. Also, these slug zombies look really cool with their shadow-obscured faces and glowing eyes, but that sort of leads me into Sanguine's biggest graphical issue, one that I'm pretty sure everybody's already noticed. This game is way too dark for its own good. I mean, listen, I like a nice spooky room with only a single flickering fluorescent light hanging overhead as much as the next guy, but if I'm wearing a headlamp in a pitch black room and I still can't see anything, we may have an issue. A little bit later in the demo, I also noticed that the flashlight doesn't actually shine on every surface, so there are places in the game where it's effectively useless. I think if the developer adds a bit of light bounce back on the character models so she can be seen and a little more effective illumination on the environment, this problem would probably be solved. Like I already talked about, this effect works great on the monsters' faces, so I don't want to lose that, but I'd also like to be able to tell if there's a door in the room I'm in or where I am in said room. Outside of that, I really appreciate that 4:3 aspect ratios are selectable in the options, but they just crop the normal 16:9 screen format, cutting off important stuff like text and obscuring parts of the environment. So if you forced me to make a choice, I'd probably pick widescreen and the ability to see stuff.
Fat chance, lady. There's only one way out of this swamp.
All in all, I'd say Sanguine's demo is actually a really great look at what could be. This Ryan guy is very obviously heading in the right direction, and I think a lot of my complaints can be explained away with the sort of alpha state of the project. I'm really hoping this thing gets the time in the oven it needs because its music, atmosphere, survival horror gameplay, and look is very much my jam. With a nice layer of polish and a few tightened screws here or there, Sanguine would be punching way above its class, so let's hope that's exactly what it gets. Good luck, Ryan Berg, and I think I speak for everyone who loves this genre when I say, we're all pulling for you.
I gotta admit, this place has all the makings of a horror movie. Seriously, what kind of a guy calls a place Rockwood? Sounds like the name of a lousy punk band.
Flesh Made Fear by Tainted Pack is a really interesting survival horror title with a bit of an 80s slasher kind of atmosphere, and right off the bat, I was struck with the impression that this is a much more complete feeling experience than a lot of the demos we usually cover in this video series. It's kind of hard to explain verbally, but when it's in your hands, you can tell it's a vertical slice of something that's already pretty close to the finish line. I mean, we've got this really snazzy looking intro, and all the characters have voice acted lines. Sure, it's not the best you're ever gonna hear in the medium.
I don't know, Cat. I mean, we're good. This is Ripper Guy. He's not just another bad guy. He's a ghost wrapped in crazy.
But there's a pretty clear level of polish here before we even get into the actual game. Speaking of which, we start off with some backstory of this doctor who apparently wasn't satisfied after working on MK Ultra, so he started experimenting on turning people into brainwashed slaves to create the perfect soldier. And after failing to reach that goal, the guy figures, well, he's never really going to understand that process until he experiences it himself. Which, I mean, it's not the worst line of reasoning I've ever seen in a game like this. Now, would it make more scientific sense to work on a really efficient bomb or something? Yes, but would that make a better plot for a horror game? No, not at all. Anyways, Doc Ripper over here, great name by the way, obviously has gone over the deep end, so he sets out into the world, continuing his research, leaving a trail of missing people and brainless zombies in his wake. So the government calls in the wildly awesome sounding RIP squad to see what's going on. After the team finds the bridge into the equally cool sounding Rotwood is impassable, Jack and his partner Natalie are sent out to lower it. Which, I think I don't really need to say this, but obviously that's going to require a bit of survival horror exploration, puzzle solving, and key hunting. After the two end up getting separated, the new plan is for Jack to continue on to the bridge controls while Natalie heads back to regroup with the rest of the team. On the way, we come across both environmental and regular old plain storytelling that lets us know Doc Ripper has set up shop in this town, and it didn't take too long after that for things to start turning very Romero-esque.
What the?
Now with the small town's population worth of zombies on his heels, Jack makes it to the bridge controls, only to find his squad mates missing, a massive clawed creature on the loose, and a barricade preventing him from proceeding any further. Now this is small town America, so obviously the guy's able to easily get his hands on the components necessary for a high explosive device, and he clears the tunnel into town where the demo ends on Jack carefully heading in while he's watched by what I can only assume is the good doctor. Overall, a great little setup for what's shaping up to be a nice late 80s, early 90s kind of schlocky horror movie story. Of course, you can have all the great storytelling in the world, but at the end of the day, this is a survival horror game and not a walking simulator, so it's the gameplay that really matters. And on that front, I'm very much picking up what this demo is throwing down. Movement is handled with tank controls, as is dictated by international law, and the general layout is satisfyingly Resident Evil inspired. The area you need to explore in this little taste of the game is actually sort of big, and you're definitely going to need to backtrack through it a few times after getting your hands on the necessary keys and items. In terms of puzzles, I didn't exactly come across anything too challenging, mostly just your average find X item to use on Y object type of deal, which, to be fair, is usually the kind of adventure game approach that I enjoy. Although the option to avoid encounters with Rotwood's shambling dead body population is always going to be available, you're going to have to fight every so often, and when you do, fans of the genre are going to be right at home. I will say though, Flesh Made Fear adds on the typical survival horror combat style by making melee way more of a viable option. Essentially, if you're not facing more than 2 or 3 zombies, you can almost solely rely on Jack's stylish, dual machete-based kung fu. Although I did notice that sometimes it's possible to knock an enemy into a wall, which will make it so you can't hit them, but they're still able to hit you. Not exactly the kind of bug that ruins a game, but annoying nonetheless. And speaking of which, it would be kind of nice if the zombies didn't take quite so many shots to put down. I mean, you're given enough ammo to drop just about everything you come across in the demo, so it's not a resource thing, but it just feels kind of weird to need to dump upwards of 8 bullets into a single baseline starting enemy. And I'll admit, this next one is sort of a non-issue, but I want to mention it anyways. Fear Made Flesh works great when you're using a controller, but just like a few other games in the genre I played recently, the developer seems to have segmented certain control features between the D-pad and analog stick as if the former was going to be the less used option between the two. I'm not really sure if this is just a common oversight with indie developers or if, without my knowledge, the D-pad has cultivated some sort of a bad reputation, but this issue seems to pop up a lot when I make these videos. When you go to aim your weapon, it's possible to move your reticle around, but only when you're using the analog stick and not the D-pad. Now, in the game's defense, the auto-aim does work really well, so it's not like this gets in the way a lot, but when there's multiple targets and you want to focus on just one of them, it is kind of lame needing to take your thumb off the D-pad to use the analog stick when they serve essentially the same purpose. Which I guess brings up an important question for you guys watching. Are all of you using a thumbstick for tank controls? Like, is it just me that prefers the D-pad? Because that's totally possible, I really want to know. Heading more in a purely positive direction, I really enjoyed this game's soundtrack. It's filled with creepy, synthy melodies that fortify its classic 80s horror movie aesthetic. And you know, now that we're talking about stuff that's really great, this game looks amazing. Its visual style, or maybe more its visual inspiration, sits somewhere in the middle of Sony's first and second generation game consoles, which I thought was a really cool looking approach. By my eye, the environments, characters, and overall 3D geometry resembles something that the PS2 could believably be pumping out, but the color limitations and low-res textures might make you believe they came from the 32-bit PS1 era. It's a great little mashup of graphical styles that draws on a few different types of nostalgia. There's also a nice looking faux CRT filter over top of everything that gives a nice bit of crunchy, old analog texture to the visuals, and while I'm typically not a fan of these kind of filters, I've been starting to like them more and more lately. In most cases, I prefer to have the ability to turn these things off when they're included, but here with this game, I think it might look a little flat without it. The only issue is these kinds of small details and grain constantly moving around the screen tend to really mess with YouTube's specific video compression, so hopefully zooming in real far will give you guys a good idea of what's going on. I was really happy to see that Flesh Made Fear has a nice variety of enemy character models, and I also got a kick out of all the 2D sprite-based assets in the inventory and menus. All that being said though, I did have a few graphics-related issues. For example, I like the included subtitles and I can appreciate the aesthetic of having them draw on screen like they're being typed out, but this can really get in the way of fluid gameplay when you go to examine something in the environment. I mean, it works fine for short 3 or 4 word sentences, but for anything longer than that, I felt like I was just sitting there forever waiting for the rest of the text to appear. I think it's a fine feature for cutscenes, but maybe during gameplay, having the text appear all at once would be a little more convenient and user-friendly. And continuing down that good idea, flawed execution sort of path, I really like that your flashlight can cast shadows. I just think maybe the player's character model should be omitted from that process. This very well could just be a me thing, but I did sort of find the constant long stretching shadows of my own hands in the distance to be a little distracting while running around, and the same thing goes for the dialogue scenes, although the effect wasn't quite so bad there. All in all, Flesh Made Fear has me really excited for its eventual full release. Tainted Pact seems to have a very polished, old-school survival horror game on their hands, and they're clearly aiming it right at my specific tastes. It's got itself a great setting, an eerie atmosphere, awesome soundtrack, and this might sound a little dumb, but I just kind of love seeing these new entries in the genre include honest-to-goodness zombies as enemies. I mean, what can I say? I saw my first zombie movie as a preteen, and I sort of stopped developing emotionally and conceptually from that day. You might be looking at me and thinking, there must be something going through this guy's mind, but in reality, it's just a 24/7 loop of Tom Savini's remake of Night of the Living Dead just going non-stop.
More of them? What the hell happened to those people?
Okay, so how's this for an elevator pitch? The keyboard-based spin-off Typing of the Dead meets Resident Evil. I was first introduced to Outerbrain Studios' Blood Typers thanks to a viewer DMing me on Twitter, and at first the concept understandably put me off. but after playing it, I'm way more on board now than I would have originally imagined. Now, before we get into it, a disclaimer. Despite needing to type out like 30 to 40 pages a month in video scripts, I am notoriously bad at this. I never learned how to type properly, and to this day, I still need to look at my keyboard while I'm doing it. So I wasn't really able to get the full enjoyment out of this title that I can tell should be accessible. Essentially, I kept getting to a certain point, and when tougher monsters started getting close, I wasn't able to fend them off or run away fast enough because I kept needing to look from my screen to my keyboard and vice versa. That being said, for a guy that's almost disabled when it comes to this game's core mechanic, I was really surprised at how well it worked for me. So if you haven't noticed yet, the general rule here is that nearly every single in-game action is pulled off by typing something. Moving, picking up or using items, attacking, opening doors, operating puzzles. Just about the only things that you have direct, non-typing based control over is looking at your map and turning your view, which is handled by the left and right shift keys. From what I can tell by trailers and people streaming the game, there seems to be a big focus on multiplayer, almost Resident Evil Outbreak-esque hijinks, which honestly looks really fun. That being the case, when you start a game, it might feel a little less survival horror and a lot more online multiplayer action, but that being said, when you actually load into the game's single scenario, things do feel pretty authentic to the genre. In a really interesting move, your path to the mansion is dotted with exposition that you need to actually type out to move forward, and once you get in, there are items to collect, keys to look for, and exploration that needs doing. Eventually, you're going to make your way to a computer terminal and you'll have to type out what's on screen, which is when it turns into some sort of a biomechanical monster and transports you to a nightmare version of the environment that I think has a different layout but definitely has monsters roaming around. To engage in combat, you'll need to hit the tab key, which sort of acts like holding the shoulder button in a survival horror game, readying your weapon. Then if an enemy's near you, you'll need to type out the words that appear above its head to successfully attack it. And I was really surprised at how well this works. I mean, I was having a really good time beating on zombies here. Like I was saying earlier, I did need to always look at both the screen to see the required words and my keyboard to type them out, so I wasn't able to dominate or anything, but I did well enough to be able to see what makes this game so fun. After I hit a wall with the gameplay, I headed over to YouTube to see what the multiplayer's like, and it really does seem like a blast, with mechanics that support it really well. For example, when you're typing out the long passages required to interact with the computers, you're basically defenseless, so having a crew of people backing you up would probably make for a nicely tense situation. And again, there is some semblance of survival horror gameplay to be found here too, so there's really a lot to be excited over. Now, since I currently reside in an old folks home and thus cannot type at all, I can't really extract the fun out of this game that I think most other people would be able to, but I can see that it is there. So if you're even okay at mashing keys on a keyboard, I think this would make for a really good time, especially if you get some friends together. Plus, at the time of writing this script, Blood Typers is only like $10 on Steam, and there is always the free demo if you're not completely sold. I mean, I know I certainly wasn't when I was first introduced to the idea, but it is a really fun concept, and if I ever get off of my lazy ass and figure out how to type, this is definitely going to be the first thing I use to test my newfound abilities. And then my final plan to transition over to a custom mechanical keyboard review channel will be nearly complete. Alright, so a while back I received a Twitter DM from the official Game Grumps account, and the person who sent it was offering access to a game they had apparently developed, which was a wild feeling. I mean, I'm a really small channel in the grand scheme of things, and it's not exactly common for a multi-million follower account to just message my small ass out of the blue. But, then I started thinking about it, which drove me to the obvious conclusion. Either they were hacked, or this was some sort of scam, or maybe some combination of the two. So I just kind of went on with my day. Well, that was June of last year, and while going through my DMs recently to find a link I was sent by a thumbnail artist, I found that DM again and actually looked into it. Well, it turns out not only does Game Grumps actually have a game development arm and did develop the title in question, but they also follow me. So big apology to the person I just sort of assumed was a bot, and in a better late than never sort of scenario, here's a look at Homebody, a hybrid survival horror game that I was sent to review nearly a year ago, which to be fair is about on par with my channel's content schedule anyways. The game starts out with our main character Emily having some sort of a wild-ass dream. It doesn't last very long, but when she comes to, it turns out that she was on the way to spend some time with her friends and had become so freaked out at the idea that she needed to pull over and calm herself down a bit. Through this interaction with her friend Laura and the rest of the game's story events, we learn that Emily suffers from a really debilitating form of social anxiety, something that affects her so deeply that the concept of spending a few nights with her best friends in a big house seems like a potential nightmare to her. And I'm gonna level with you guys. This may have been very early on in the experience, but I was not liking too much of where I thought the game was going at this point. Now, for a bit of context, I've always been a huge supporter of the whole walking simulator thing. I mean, sure, I don't like every one of them that comes out, but I think there's genuine value in a game that serves mostly as a quasi-interactive narrative experience. And I bring this up because Homebody was giving me the beginning of a walking simulator sort of vibes, and while I do enjoy the odd entry in the genre, that's just not what I prepared myself to play that night. I want you to go ahead and keep that little factoid in your pocket for later. Alright, so getting back into the matter at hand, as Emily wills herself to get on with the trip, she finally approaches the Airbnb that her and her friends had booked, and when she shows up, we get to see a nice little sneak preview of the dynamic here. While most of her friends are happy to see her, there's a bit of an uneasy atmosphere floating in the air, and you can't really blame all of it on the person with the anxiety disorder. After this little front porch meeting, I was given control over Emily, which I immediately took that chance to walk around the house and get to know the group. And beyond the dialogue with her friends giving me some insight, the one thing that made its presence well known during this period was a permeating atmosphere that felt equal parts cozy and foreboding. Throughout the house, there was no background music being played, just the ambiance of the environment. The creaking floorboards, the noise of an 8-bit video game being played on an old CRT, and the sound of curtains flowing in the breeze. Honestly, it's kind of amazing how well the developers tapped into the feeling of being in an old, sort of scary, sort of inviting, unfamiliar house. Getting back to the story though, remember when I told you to keep in mind how I thought things were going in the direction of a narrative-only walking simulator? Well, as I explored and got to know Emily's friend group, the power goes out. And I'm sitting here thinking, okay, I could see this at some point becoming a horror story. But then as I walked around in the pitch black house trying to figure out how I could get the power back on, this happens. No cutscene, no fanfare, some deranged guy in a creepy-ass costume just casually walks in the room and stabs both of us to death. It all happened so fast, I didn't have time to think, otherwise I probably could have gotten away instead of just standing there in awe of the whole situation. Now, it's important that I mention that up to this point, there was absolutely no indication that anything like this was even remotely on the table. I mean, I was getting the slight hint of some vague sense of negativity, but the entire intro of the game does this amazing job of misdirecting all of that towards Emily and her anxiety issues. And stay strapped in because from here, things only continue to get more strange. After dying a bloody death, we're transported right back to the moment Emily first entered the house, and I immediately went to the woman I had just watched get carved up with the intent of asking her, what the hell's going on around here? So I tried, making some inquiries to that effect, but every time I chose one as an option, Emily would just say something else, something unrelated to the massacre that had just taken place. And the same thing happens with everyone else. I can talk their ears off about anything as long as it isn't related to a cloaked serial killer ripping all of them apart less than 10 minutes ago. And right about here is when I perked up in my seat a bit. The misdirection at the start, the introduction of a clock tower-esque psycho killer, and then Emily's inability to communicate the situation she's stuck in. You could definitely say that I was good and strapped in by this point, but things were only going to get more surreal. After trying to figure out what all of this was about, once again, the crazy guy in black started cutting his way through Emily's friend group, and after he did the same thing to her, we wake right back up at the same point again. And this is when I started to think, okay, I'm figuring things out. We're obviously operating under some sort of Groundhog's Day rules, which means the events of this night are going to keep looping, and we as Emily are doomed to relive them, each time getting just a little closer to something resembling an explanation. And as I continued to get stabbed, I would come across these events just before coming to back at the house. At first, it was being visited by another member of the friend group that was supposed to be on his way, and then sometimes it would be strange dream sequences or a bit of backstory into Emily's relationship with her friends. Then at one point, we get hit with this memory of Emily being confronted by the guy who actually owns the house while she's on her way driving to it. It's a wild ride sifting through all these fractured bits of info, trying to decide what's relevant, what's true, and what's a dream. Now, in full disclosure, I haven't beaten this game yet, so I may not be in the best position to start making guesses as to where it's actually headed, but even so, I can say that Homebody's story is mind-blowingly interesting. Like I already said, at first, this thing had me preparing to be underwhelmed, but then it sucker punches me with some of the most compelling mystery content I could have possibly imagined. I'm not going to spoil anything more than I already have because I do want you guys to check this game out, but eventually things take even crazier turns as concepts like eternal life and even more supernatural elements begin to be introduced. It's a hell of a trip. Now, from the story I just described, I could see the average viewer scratching their head as to how any of this could play into the survival horror genre. And let me assure you, this game has no issues answering that question from nearly the first moment you're able to actually control your character. From those very first moments, as I took Emily on a walking tour of the house, I ran into quite a few jury-rigged mechanical devices, electric locks, and tons of what are obviously puzzle pieces. Which is actually an apt term, as the entire house turned out to be one giant survival horror adventure game puzzle box. As a bit of an example, I came across a clue in one room that led me to a torn piece of paper in another, pointing at a specific page in a book somewhere else that got me into a room in the basement. It's essentially the kind of puzzle-solving gameplay that we've come to love from this genre, but banging on all cylinders. Since you're locked in a loop, some actions aren't going to be possible until a specific time, and part of progressing is getting so familiar with that loop and discovering so much that you gain access to rooms and devices that'll let you skip past some of those elements. It's honestly a really cool system that utilizes every single room in the house. Which, since we're on the subject, this place doesn't exactly start out as the most sizable location the genre's ever seen before. You might have access to like 4 or 5 rooms, and 2 of them are locked, but as you progress further, you start to uncover a genuine labyrinth of new areas, and it takes some serious sleuthing to get to that point. Without a doubt, these are some of the more challenging puzzles I've ever come up against in this genre. The game was constantly forcing me to get familiar with every examinable object in the place, and when I felt stuck, I found often that it was helpful just talking to Emily's friends and seeing what they thought. And barring that, sometimes in between loops, this guy will just come out and offer up a hint. It's a really interesting take on the genre's classic style of exploration and puzzle solving, and before you gain access to some of the areas that'll let you skip steps, it creates this really cool gameplay loop where you're optimizing your actions and trying to get things done before the killer shows up. At one point, I just so happened to be in this room and looking through this peephole at just the right time when I found out that the serial killer actually takes a secret elevator into the house. As you experience the night's events over and over, you'll come across a bunch of little moments like this just by pure chance, and the introduction of a single new thing into your world of repeated motions feels like solving 10 puzzles at once in terms of satisfaction. As I'm sure you can tell by now, the game's going for a widescreen, retro sort of look. To my eye, it seems to be targeting something approaching the Dreamcast capabilities with its relatively high geometry 3D models and dither pattern. And I'd like to think that most of you guys by now know me well enough to understand that's typically all it takes to get into my heart. But to sweeten the deal, Homebody also keeps its retro look consistent when it comes to things like text and menu elements. You really have no idea how much I hate seeing these realistically low-poly retro aesthetic games using smooth, modern-looking fonts and 2D assets, so hats off to the team for getting that right. I've gotta say though, the game is doing something I really don't like with its animations. I'm assuming they're going for a look reminiscent of that one CG animated Spider-Man movie with this very low FPS sort of effect to its animations. My GPU is reporting it is running at 60 FPS, but it looks more to me like something around 15 or 20. Now I get that beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and I'm sure there's someone out there watching right now who likes this, but personally, I really can't stand it. I did eventually get to a point where the animation stopped registering as something jittery or being wrong with my graphics settings, but even then they managed to get in the way. In fact, just about the only complaint I have regarding Homebody's gameplay, outside of this puzzle being way too damn hard to solve, is that the weird emulated low frame rate effect seems to cause a sort of lag in the controls. It felt to me like pressing a different direction while running took a noticeable amount of time to register, and when you're using tank controls, that can make accurate movement really hard. Actually, it sort of feels on par with how a game would handle if it was running at such a severely low frame rate. Now on the plus side, because of the game's looping nature, you're not necessarily punished for dying, so not being able to get away from the killer isn't going to do much more than cause you to repeat a few actions. But it's not like that fact keeps the game's controls from feeling laggy and sort of unresponsive. But hey, you know, only one downside in one of my videos is pretty damn good all things considered. Homebody really surprised me. I mean, I didn't know what to expect at first, but even after the rug had been pulled out from under me, it kept inventing new, lower levels for me to fall to. It takes your average survival horror tool set and puts it into a really interesting box. And I know what you're thinking, another non-combat horror game that Jared actually enjoys? Believe me, I'm just as shocked as you are. And just in case you're wondering if my positive outlook has anything to do with this game coming from a giant YouTube channel like the Game Grumps, well, I'm gonna level with you. I don't think I've ever watched a single video from them in my life. In fact, I don't really like the whole Let's Play format in general. Besides, I waited so long to actually cover this game, I'm assuming any goodwill I may have had with the guy who runs their social media is long gone by now. But hey, regardless of who may have missed out on a potentially good connection in content creation, what we're left with here is a kick-ass hybrid of the survival horror genre. And let's be very honest here, the real draw, yet another modern game that uses dithering. For the right person watching, I don't have to say anything more than that. Cult of Blood from Dusty Box has been on my list for a while now. Of course, it using the word survival horror in its description piqued my ear, but after watching the trailer on its Steam page, I honestly didn't know what to think. I mean, it looked like there were a lot of gameplay elements that seemed like they would clash to me, and without stringing you guys along after playing it, I think this two-person development team might be onto something very interesting. Before we touch on that though, the demo starts out with two cops, Eero and Willie, arguing over paperwork. By the way, I'm just guessing on the pronunciation of that name. I've never met anybody from South America with that name, so I'm guessing the guy or guys that created this game are from Spain. Either way though, este es un nombre latino, creo. Let's hope I'm right or else I'm gonna sound pretty dumb for the remainder of this section. Anyways, after a bit of arguing, some terrified person runs into the place yelling about vampires, so this guy with the incredibly powerful mustache orders Eero to drive him to where the supposed vampires are. And when we get there, obviously there aren't any vampires, so we go on our way. Only plot twist, there are vampires and now we have to fight them. And double plot twist, this guy right here is in cahoots with them.
You gotta be fucking kidding me! He got away with this whole time! You bastards! You've been hoodwinked!
So after we eventually get knocked out, the guys in the masks have our lovable cop protagonist in some sort of a ritual until they get shot up with arrows by this woman who for some reason can rescue Edo and tell him where he can meet her again but can't just accompany him to that place. I don't know why, that bothered me for some reason. Well anyways, we head over to her cabin, but the bridge leading to it breaks, so we do a little fetch quest for this guy who has the body and the beard every man dreams of. Except once we get him the red vial that he asks for, this happens. So we head on over to the cabin Robin Hood told us about, and oh my god. Okay, so when I wrote this script, I had a joke in mind where I would spell Robin Hood with a Y, like a girl's name Robin, but I have no idea how I thought you guys would be able to see that in the video. I mean, I can't say that verbally. You guys get where I was going with that. Okay, so now that we met up with our savior, she introduces us to this woman who gives us the backstory on what's going on here. Apparently, at some point, this group came to the village offering vast riches to anyone who chose to worship their goddess, and the people living there were a fiscally minded bunch, so they said sure. Eventually, the goddess offered everybody a drink, and at first it was the best thing ever. The townspeople felt alive and energetic, but eventually it came to become an addiction. Everyone grew to depend on this drink, and I'm not sure how this follows that, but then the goddess was like, you guys need to start making sacrifices to me. And furthermore, I'm gonna turn your strongest warriors into my underlings, and they're gonna force you into indentured servitude. So then it turns out that she wasn't exactly a goddess yet, but was close enough to start the process. All she needed was 4 guardians, and she already had acquired 3, leaving the 4th, which for some reason is Edo. The old lady explains it's because she needed someone untouched by her magic, but if that's the case, what was this then? Regardless though, our protagonist seems to understand that he's in a video game, so now it's time for him to hunt down the other 3 guardians and cut their heads off to keep her from attaining godhood. Now we do have to keep in mind that this is being developed by 2 people, and they've clearly put a lot of work into this thing, which takes a lot of skill and talent that I definitely don't have. But that being said, this isn't exactly the best story I've ever heard before. If my theory of these 2 being Latino ends up panning out, maybe there's a bit of value lost in the translation, but as it is, this certainly isn't the type of story I'd personally go for. On the plus side though, Cult of Blood is doing some much more impressive stuff in terms of its gameplay. At the start of the demo, I was really stoked to see proper tank controls driven movement and a fixed perspective. Classic stuff, right? But after the game introduced me to its combat, things started going in a really wild direction. Alright, so the idea here is for Edo to always be facing off with a group of bad guys, and the system they chose for the combat is something I don't think I've ever seen before. Hitting the left trigger draws your weapon and locks you onto the nearest opponent. If you're using a melee weapon, it's a fairly action game sort of system where you dodge incoming attacks with a dash move, and when there's an opening, deliver a few hits of your own. And honestly, it's really fun. Your dodge move doesn't give you a lot of iframes to work with, so you'll have to get pretty good at reading your foe's attacks, which admittedly took me a while to get used to. But when things in Cult of Blood start flowing, it feels surprisingly tight. When you've got a firearm equipped though, things start to get real weird. It's basically the same setup, only you also have to use the right analog stick to control a little reticle that floats near your target. This thing right here decides whether or not your shots are going to land, and I found the combination of dodging attacks, aiming at the enemy, and controlling a separate crosshair to ensure your shots hit the right target to be a really fun combination. I mean, it might sound a bit simplistic, but in practice it makes for this awesomely tense combat experience. I'll admit I never really got good at this mechanic, but that didn't stop me from having a blast trying to get that way. Now, it does need to be said that there really aren't too many elements of survival horror to be found here. You do have the fixed perspectives and controls from the genre, but at least in this demo, there aren't any puzzles to solve, a very brief bit of backtracking, no inventory management, and things are much more linear than most fans of these games might like. That being said, if you look up the term survival horror on Google right now, you'll find 3 online co-op titles, 2 narrative-driven walking simulators, a platformer, and The Last of Us. So if we're going to get pedantic, I think we should start from the top down. It seems to me that Cult of Blood is using a sort of proto-survival horror package to deliver its uniquely fun combat system, and I would say there's nothing wrong with that. Plus, I had a blast playing it. So until one of you guys start your own channel centered around an obscure subgenre from the PS1 era that no one cares about, this is how it is.
There once was an old sow with 3 little pigs. She had not enough to keep them. She sent them out to seek their fortune.
Just as I was wrapping up the script for this video, I was contacted by a developer on Twitter who offered me a look at their survival horror game, The Third Pig, which, to be honest, I was looking for an excuse to put off doing a voiceover for a few more minutes anyways, so I said sure, I'd take a look. And after trying it out, I'm actually really impressed. Now, to put a little context to that, it is going to be a free game, so I imagine it didn't have a sizable budget, and that's good because it only took me about 20 minutes to beat. On top of that, I'm getting the impression that it might be the first or one of the first projects they've ever finished and put up on Steam. With all that in mind though, I feel like this person may have some genuine talent here. This thing's got a short but sweet story concerning the 3 little pigs, but in this version the wolf is kind of like a hired assassin. Oh, and the woodsman and the eponymous Little Red Riding Hood play a role too. And speaking of which, shout out to Eurothug4000, a really great content creator who lent their voice to the project. The general idea is that the huntsman wants you dead, but the wolf wants to work for his meal, so they've survival horrorized the pig's house and they want him to try his best to get out of it. While you're doing that, the wolf is patrolling around, and the only way I found to duck him was to jump in the outhouse for a bit, which always seems to break his pursuit. Which, might be a lesson we can take with us into the real world. If there's a person out there who's trying to eat you, maybe they won't want to anymore if your entire being is covered in the smell of shit. Now, like I've said about 10 trillion times, I am no fan of non-combat, persistent stalker type of games, but for this short slice of the genre, it works well enough. I mean, I'm fairly certain combat would have made the game orders of magnitude more challenging to work on. I will say, movement does feel a little too fast and the camera's a little too zoomed in most of the time, so running can actually be a bit of a hindrance until you've memorized the layout of the house. But getting items, using them on the environment, and exploring, it all works the way you'd want it to in one of these games. What I'm trying to say is, there's some real promise on display here. Most of the systems that make the genre tick outside of the combat are implemented in some rudimentary way, and more than anything, I just like the idea of a survival horror game set in the 3 Little Pigs narrative universe. I also thought the look of the game was particularly well handled. The black and white world with only the items being colored was a nice touch, and I always enjoy low-res textures in these throwback aesthetic titles. It never fails to remind me of running console games on PC emulators as a teenager and seeing their assets at way higher resolutions than they were supposed to be. Like I said before, it's a free game and it looks like it'll be coming out soon. It may not be a polished survival horror classic, but I put it in this video because I think it's totally possible that we see Pop's Arcade on this channel again at some point. So here's hoping he keeps grinding away at game development and maybe one day gives us the next survival horror milestone.
It's a long story.
Alright guys, that's it for today's showcase of indie survival horror talent. Hopefully I've introduced all of you to enough new titles to hold you over until I make another one of these, which, judging by the rate I'm finding out about these new projects, shouldn't be very long at all. Hopefully I see all of you when that day comes, but until then, as usual, I'm Jared, and this is Avalanche Reviews.